Genesis 41, we will be considering the first 16 verses. Genesis 41, verses 1 through 16. I would like to read them, then pray. Actually, let's pray first, then we'll read them, and then we'll begin in the message. Why don't we pray? Heavenly Father, I ask of you that you would take your word and the reading of your word, teaching of your word, and bless it to us, that we would be given fresh and new, and deeper, more accurate thoughts of you and of your way in the world and your way with us, who you are, and what that means for us. So we ask for grace. Help us to give heed, to understand. Help me to teach well, and for all of us to sit as we should under your word. In Christ's name, amen. Genesis 41, verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So, in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And that's the end of our text today. All right, so the title of the message today is Joseph's Deliverance, Conviction, and Witness. Now, since we've been talking about the person Joseph, we might think, and all the things that have been happening to him, when we say his conviction, we mean his sentencing to some other prison. But in this instance, that's not what I mean. I mean his personal convictions. So Joseph's deliverance, Joseph's conviction, and Joseph's witness. 3 things that we see in this text, at least we see them beginning in this portion. We see a number of things concerning Joseph and God's purpose for him within the larger plan of God in the world in this chapter. Some of the greatest lessons of Joseph's life are still out in front of us, admittedly. in the weeks to come. But more is happening here in these verses than simply moving the story along, and I hope to draw that out. I want to suggest that in these verses we see the beginnings of Joseph's deliverance. For the first time in his life, he will be substantially and permanently delivered. Anything else, things got really bad, and then they were less bad, but still bad, and then they got worse, and then they were less bad, but still bad, and then they got worse, and then now he's as high as it gets. He's the vizier of Egypt by the time the chapter is over. And it's remarkable. And so, for the first time in his life, he is substantially and permanently delivered, and we will consider the beginnings of that today. What were the circumstances that occasioned this deliverance? That's the first thing. Secondly, I will also argue that in these verses we learn a bit about the convictions that were lodged in the heart and in the head of Joseph. What convictions did he have? What kind of things did he believe? And finally, I will argue that we have here in Joseph's interpretation of the dream, which is not something we've read yet, but it's in this chapter. In his interpretation of the dream, while at the same time all the mysterious diviner priests of Egypt were unable to discern the plan of God and know what the interpretation was, we have here a loud and a convincing witness and testimony to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh about the reality of Joseph's God and the superiority of Joseph's God, that this God is supreme. So those are the things I see here in this chapter, and that I see beginning in these first 16 verses. As we dive in, rather than a lengthy review of the previous chapter and things we've seen in previous weeks, I just want to jump right in and do no more review than is necessary to explain the text here. Before we dive in, though, and begin just looking verse by verse at the text we've read so far, I want to provide you with a little bit of an outline of the chapter, just so you kind of understand where we are and what happens. The entire chapter is one complete portion of the Joseph story. That is, this is one of those sections in your Bibles where the chapter breaks are really helpful and really well laid out. First of all, it's its own unit because it's distinct from what goes before and what comes after. Consider these surrounding sections. In the previous chapter, we ended with the line, let's look at verse 20, Genesis chapter 40, verse 20. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Then this portion begins with the words, after 2 whole years. So we have, in the span of 4 words in my English Bible, zoomed 2 whole years, when the previous chapter was just a matter of a few nights. So now we've zipped ahead, we've covered 2 years in 4 words. We've not said anything about them, just that they were 2 whole years. After 2 whole years. That's all we've said. Also, we know, so it's a different, we've moved in time 2 years. Also, we know the portion ends at the end of this chapter, at the end of chapter 41. It ends because we know that it comes to an end there, because the entire last half of this chapter chronicles Joseph's administration of the authority given to him during the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. So that's what the whole second half of the chapter is all about. But then it jumps into chapter 42. We change scenes. We're back in the land of Canaan when Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt. So there on the tail end is another totally different sort of thing. So in this chapter we have something that is different from what goes before and different from what goes after. It's its own unit. And so we have this distinct portion within this larger told out section of Genesis about what became of the descendants of Jacob. And this whole thing belongs together. I hope you see that this is not just, I'm not just trying to tell you that something different is happening in the chapter before and something different is happening in the chapter afterwards. I also want you to see it's its own story. It has its own plot line. And it functions as its own unit. It has its own plot. Naturally, this passage acts, I think, as a hinge for the wider plot in Joseph's life. If we're going to look at Joseph's whole story, things have been kind of going down, 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 and then here now there's this great exaltation and all this authority, and everything hinges upon these events that happen in this chapter. That's certainly true. But again, this chapter has its own plot. As I understand it, let me just tell you what I think the plot is. There is this impending tragedy of famine coming upon Egypt. And upon not just Egypt, but the larger region of the world in a few short years. But the God of Joseph will intervene in time to save the people, but He does so in such a way as to exalt Joseph to power. That's one thing it does. And also God does it in such a way to publish His own name as superior to the lesser gods of Egypt, who are helpless in the face of such an event. God does this, brings about this famine, this tragedy, this calamity upon Egypt in such a way as if they will listen to Him, they can avoid the tragic elements of it. And not only that, they will see that God announced it beforehand. God said, not only do I know about it, but I'm determined to do it. And the only way you can learn about what's going to happen is by consulting a man who serves me. None of your people know anything. They're all in the dark. Only my mouthpiece can tell you what to do. And no one is so wise as him as to prepare you for it, and He Himself will get you through. What a testimony. He publishes His own name. He exalts Joseph to power, but He also publishes His own name as superior to the lesser gods of Egypt. Within that plot, we are today merely considering the first 16 verses, which all, in fact, occur before Joseph is exalted to power, before the people of Egypt are saved, even before there's much opportunity for God's name to be published in the land. So as far as an outline of the chapter, it's pretty basic. Verses 1 through 8, and in my Bible, most of these are grouped already in paragraphs. It's helpful that way. Verses 1 through 8, Pharaoh had 2 dreams which greatly troubled him, and he could find no wise man to interpret them for him. But then in verses 9 through 13, it would appear the chief cupbearer, as he was going about his duties and serving the Pharaoh, overheard all the trouble and saw the commotion and realized what was happening and was reminded of what he had forgotten. He remembers Joseph and speaks to Pharaoh about him. And then in verses 14 through 16, Joseph is summoned before Pharaoh. And when he's summoned, he answers Pharaoh concerning his own ability to interpret dreams and how he has it. And also he tells him, and this may escape you, you may not have noticed this before, but we'll talk about it today. He tells him God's purpose in giving Pharaoh the dreams before he even hears about the dreams. He tells him what God's purpose is in giving him the dreams, what God's up to. Then verses 17 through 24, Pharaoh explains his dream, but he adds to it his own troubles that he's been having and what his impressions have been about the dream. 25 through 36 then, most people split this up. Most people will say the first portion, Joseph gives the interpretation, and then the second portion, Joseph gives his counsel. But that's mistaken. The entire thing, verses 25 through 36, is Joseph's message from God to Pharaoh concerning the interpretation and the counsel that God would give him so that things could turn out favorably for Pharaoh as Joseph said that they would. Joseph tells him God's going to give you a message that will make for peace, make for the welfare of Egypt. And that's exactly what God did. So then, following that, verses 37 through 45, Pharaoh responds to this interpretation and this message by recognizing the rightness of the interpretation and the wisdom of the counsel. And having been then blessed by this warning, he chooses God's man, the one who gave the message, to make preparations and carry out the necessary steps to prevent this disaster in Egypt. Because obviously God is with this man. Then verses 46 through 49 tell us about Joseph's administration of the 7 years of plenty. And then before moving on to the 7 years of famine, Moses goes out of his way to tell us about Joseph's 2 sons who were born to him in Egypt and about their names, and Moses gives Joseph an opportunity to testify to us about God's goodness to Joseph. This is Joseph's words about how God has been so good and faithful to him. And then 53 through 57, the rest of it is simply the beginning of Joseph's administration of the 7 years of famine. And that's the end of the chapter. And then at the end of that, then Joseph's family has heard about bread in Egypt, and they come, and then begin a whole new sequence of events. So that's the outline. That's how things proceed. So I want to look at this text, first 16 verses, under these headings: Joseph's deliverance, his conviction, and his witness. The vast majority of the text will be concerning Joseph's deliverance. And so let's just look at that. In these verses, again, we witness how Joseph was delivered from the pit and the events that occasioned his rise to the station of vizier in Egypt. So these first 8 verses, let's consider this. After 2 whole years, simply telling us the time, after all these things had happened, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. Now let's just stop there for a second. Nothing too unusual about that. There's 7 cows. That's an element of things that gets interpreted here later. But you have 7 cows that come up out of the Nile. Now, you shouldn't think that there was this crystal clear or smooth Nile River, or it's just nothing above the surface, and all of a sudden just emerging out of the water come these cows. Rather, you should think of cows doing what cows typically do in the river. That is, they just get away from the heat, they get away from the flies, they just get in the water sometime. Livestock does this commonly when they have water around. They'll just get in. And so what happens is there's these various cows that are in the water, and 7 of them come out. And these 7 that come out are fat, plump, prime for eating, right? They are well fed. And so they are choice cows in that sense. And they come up and they're plump, and they not only come out of the water and they are attractive and plump, they then feed in the reed grass. They do what cows normally do. How do they get this way? By eating what they always eat. They ate out of the reed grass. And behold, but look, 7 other cows who were ugly and thin came up out of the Nile after them. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. You think, okay, well it's strange that these cows are so plump and these are so thin, and that's a bit odd. But you don't think anything more about it. But then there's something that happens that's just grotesque, shocking, very unexpected, and disturbing. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. Right? He's startled. He has a nightmare, and he wakes up, and he's sweating. He didn't know what the heck this means. This is strange. Now, if I told you I had a dream last night and these 7 cows came out, and you would think, that is just weird. Why are you telling me that? What? It's bizarre. But again, there are times when you have a dream and you say, there's something about this dream. It's not even the details of it necessarily. It's just an overwhelming sense you have that this was not just a dream. This means something. And he has one of these. And he wakes up. Well, eventually he fell asleep again, and he dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. The word here, "were growing," is the same word used earlier when it says these other cows came up out of the Nile. It's the same word. They were coming up. They came up on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. Notice these are thin, just like those other cows were thin, blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. So that's shocking. Ears of grain don't eat. And they're certainly not cannibalistic. We've got cannibal ears of grain. It's just strange, disturbing. I don't know what this would look like. Probably not as grotesque as the 7 thin cows eating the other cows. But get out of your head some cartoonish idea of a vision. Right? This is bizarre. Also, Pharaoh's view for all of this. He's standing by the banks of the Nile. He's standing there by the river. And these cows come out. So it's not as if he's way off away on the palace overlooking and observing something. He's got a close-up view of this. These cows come up and he sees them and they're what they're doing, and these cows come up afterwards. Maybe he even has to move out of their way as they come up. And he sees them eat these other cows. It's shocking. And he wakes up startled. And he eventually falls asleep again. And he has another dream. And now from that same area come up these stalks of grain with 7 ears on it. And these look really good. And then 7 more come up after it. And that doesn't happen. It's unnatural. This is bizarre. And these are all blighted by the east wind, and something's wrong with these. And what do? They eat. They eat the others. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. He's almost relieved it was a dream. It's so strange, but so real, so vivid, so significant. So in the morning, thus, so naturally, because he had these dreams, his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So first of all, just the content of the dreams we've looked at already. But consider the worrisome nature of the dreams. I've tried to convey that a little bit as we've talked about the content and why they might be worrisome. But this word that's used here for he was troubled, it's used another place when another king has some dreams. If you want to turn with me, you might want to just mark this portion because I hope to look back there a little bit later. But go to the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar. In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream, to understand it. Right? Well, that's all we'll read there for now. But so this is common, right? I mean, we see this same sort of thing happen elsewhere in Scripture with King Nebuchadnezzar. He has this dream. It's foreboding. He doesn't know what it means. It's very different than anything he's ever had before. And he wants to know the meaning. He knows there's a meaning behind it. And so he sends for all the people in his kingdom who might be able to answer him to come and give an answer. What does it mean? There's a frightening and unnatural scenes in this dream. It's created a sense of foreboding. He has a sense, it appears that Pharaoh, as the chapter goes on, has a sense that this is a warning to him of some kind. Something bad's going to happen. This isn't good. And so he sends out to send for these men to come. These magician priests of Pharaoh would have regularly attempted these sorts of interpretations. That's part of what they were there for. But this time they're confused. They were not able to satisfy Pharaoh with an answer for one reason or another. Perhaps they heard it and they thought, I have no idea, and we better not make something up. So We just don't know. Or, probably more likely, they did make something up because they've always been making things up, and told him this is what it means, and he thought, no, I don't think, that's not what it means. I'm not convinced. I'm not persuaded you've given me a proper interpretation. One way or another, it says, right, verse 8, so in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Whether that means they couldn't interpret them at all or that they couldn't interpret them to his satisfaction, regardless, he was still on a quest to find out the meaning of these dreams. Before we move on, I want you to also highlight the helplessness of not understanding the dream. He's absolutely convinced that some source beyond human reasoning and intellect has communicated to him about something that will happen, but he can't get at what it means. He's unable. In the past, this sort of thing would happen, and these men would say, oh, this, and this, and do these things, and they would follow it, and it would work out, or it would work out somewhat, and maybe not other times. But whatever, this was the habit of things. But this time, there's no answer. He's absolutely certain he's gotten a word from something, some spiritual power, trying to connect with him and communicate to him something that's going to happen, and he has no way to know what it is. This ought to remind you of two men from the last chapter, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, who both, if we read, let's go back here, chapter 40, verse 5, one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream and each with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? And they said to him, we have had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. In other words, they had received a dream that they knew was a dream with a message. But no one could give them the message. And he says, and he looks at them, he says, why are you so downcast? And they say, because we've got a dream and no one can give us the message. Not, I had a disturbing dream last night, I just can't get it out of my head. It wasn't just the dream, it was that the dream had a message, and they couldn't get it. And they were perplexed, and they couldn't even hide it. I mean, he went in there to give them their food, and they were just downcast. What's wrong, guys? What's wrong is I can't get at this. I was favored enough to be given a glimpse into what's going to happen to me, but I can't know what it is. It's troubling. And Pharaoh here has the same sort of thing. How interesting then, that as he's going through all this trouble during the day, or during the weeks perhaps, we're not told exactly how long. I mean, in the morning he rises and he calls all these men to him, but none of them are able to interpret. Did they sin far and wide? Was it a period of time? Was it weeks, months? Was it just a couple hours? We don't know. We're not told how long it was, probably not months, but could have been several days anyway that this had gone on. And in the course of time, as the chief cupbearer is out doing his duty in the home of Pharaoh in the palace and serving him, he overhears and he says something to Pharaoh at some point, pulls him aside. It says, I remember my sins today. I remember my offenses. You wouldn't want to bring those back up to Pharaoh usually, but he says, I remember that time when Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. So we had two dreams in one night, and each one had its own interpretation. And a young Hebrew, some foreigner, was there with us. He was a servant of the captain of the guard. He belonged to Potiphar. He was one of Potiphar's servants who he had in there. When we told him, we told him what the dreams were. And when we did that, he interpreted our dreams to us. And he gave us an interpretation to each man according to his own dream. And as he interpreted it to us, Pharaoh, I'm telling you, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. And these things he told to us, having heard our dreams. This is the message. 4 things I want to say about what he tells Pharaoh. First of all, the remembrance of his sins. More than likely just refers to, I remember back whenever I had offended you so badly before and the events surrounding that. But it also might include, and I'm remembering now my forgetfulness of Joseph. Now, he doesn't mention that the one thing Joseph asked was that he be remembered. He's not going to mention that to Pharaoh. But the idea would be, if you knew that there was some guy serving in a prison who had this ability, in your devotion for me, Pharaoh, knowing that I have people who I hire and pay to do this for me, you should have mentioned him and brought him here, and we wouldn't be in the mess to begin with. Does that make sense? This guy is really good at this. He should have already been up here. So maybe I'm remembering my sins and some of my oversights and my general failings as a person, and there's some things I should probably bring to your attention now because it seems very relevant. So it could be all of those kinds of things. It's not just, I remember, what happened back then. So there's this remembrance of his sins. He's kind of bringing up that he has failed in the past at some things, and all of this is connected to those failings. All this that he's going to say. He tells them about a very similar situation. 2 dreams, 1 night, interpretations. They came true, right? He speaks about this remarkable event that the man gave these interpretations. And he speaks to him about it in a way that, and there is, it seems to be right now, an available interpreter. He was just a servant over there. So let's go find him. So now, this is then, I want to say, some of the setting for this deliverance that will happen. So then verse 14, now we find Joseph comes before Pharaoh. The Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. We can stop there. So Joseph is summoned before Pharaoh. And what do you do when you go before a judge, before a king, before a ruler? Well, you don't, if you've been in prison, you don't just show up in your prison clothes. That's a problem, right? I mean, if I told you you're going to go and argue a case before the Supreme Court, Scott, next week, get ready. I assume one of the things you will do as you prepare your trip is you will probably buy a new suit, pack it up nice and neat, right? You might probably take a shower at least that week, right? Probably that day, right? Everything's got to be just so, because you're seeking an audience with a certain group of people. And there's, not only do you want to make a good impression on them and appear respectable, but there's a certain decorum in that place that you have to observe, otherwise you will cause offense. And so, what do? The servants go and they bring him, they quickly brought him out of the pit, and when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes. So this is curious that he shaves, because the Jews they've got a law about what they're supposed to do with their beards. But Egyptians like to be clean shaven. And so what do? We go before the king. Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is shave that beard off. That's number one. Because that's against, what happens at Pharaoh's court. So you're going to shave your beard. So he shaves. Probably shaved his head too, just because of the stuff that would have been probably in his hair. Probably shaved completely. And then changed his clothes. Of course. And something, last time he's going to change his clothes in this story. Later, Pharaoh changes his clothes for him. He gives them a robe. But for now, he changes his clothes. something that would be fitting, right? Something available. Obviously, it wasn't his change of clothes, not like the spare set of clothes he had in the pit, but it's what they provided for him, right? Angela and I, one time, I took her out for dinner to a restaurant, and it was the only 5-star restaurant in St. Louis, and I took her out there, and I came in with a shirt and tie on, and the guy said, "Whoa, what?" He goes, "You can't come in here like that." And he opens up a closet, and there's about 30 different suit jackets, all various sizes. Here, I think this one looks good for you. Put it on. Like, yeah, this looks great. Can I take it home? Like, it was great. But I wasn't allowed to come in and eat without the jacket on. It was just required, right? So it's this sort of thing. They've got them. It's not every day that someone comes up out of the pit, but they do have things available in case that would be needed. And this is what happens. Now, so here he is. And he comes to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, first of all, asks if Joseph can, in fact, give an interpretation. He kind of says, "So, I've heard about you. Can you do this?" Right? So here it is. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. And I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Now, this is twice now in this section that it's told us specifically that Joseph is reported to have the ability to hear a dream and then interpret it. And I think we ought to not skip over that and say, okay, what are we being told? I think the idea is these other interpreters, so-called, wouldn't just hear it and say, "Oh, this is what it means." They would hear it, maybe they'd, okay, and they'd go and they'd have to divine and do their things and cast their lots and, kill their animals and slaughter this and offer these oblations and various things, these sacrifices to their gods, and do various rituals in order to maybe get an interpretation for this part of the dream, and then for this part of it, and then this part of it. Then we need to go consult this oracle, and they will tell us such and such. All this big show, all these steps, this elaborate plan in order to come up with the dream, with the interpretation. But Joseph, evidently, it's reported to him that he has the ability to just hear it and know the interpretation. And this is staggering. It's shocking in and of itself. "So I hear you have, it's said of you," as though he doubts it. "It has been told to me, I've heard it said that you have the ability you can hear a dream and then you can interpret it." And then Joseph answers Pharaoh concerning his ability to interpret dreams. "It is not I, God." His first words to Pharaoh are to correct him. Pharaoh's all worked up. He's been searching for days to find somebody to give him an interpretation of this dream, because there's a message here, a foreboding dream that has some sort of a message that's not good, and he needs to prepare for it. And nobody can answer him anything. He hears about Joseph, and immediately they go get him and quickly bring him here. And he says, "Now look, I've had a dream. Nobody can interpret it. I've heard you can do that sort of thing when you just hear it. What say you?" And he says, and Joseph very calmly just says, "I really can't do anything for you. It's not me. You've heard wrong. You've heard right, but you've heard wrong. I've done this in the past, but it's not in me. God Himself is the one who will do this." But he's also, so he gave him an answer about his ability to interpret dreams, but also he gives Pharaoh an answer about God's purpose for Pharaoh in giving Pharaoh the dreams and in the interpretation that will follow. He says, God will give Pharaoh, my ESV says, a favorable answer. And I don't like that translation. The word is shalom, an answer of shalom. He'll give you an answer of peace, an answer that makes for peace, for your well-being, for your good. It is not I that can give you an interpretation, but God Himself will give you an interpretation that will result in your good. God will bless you with an answer for you, for your good. What a thing. So we've considered Joseph's deliverance in terms of the circumstances that surround it and that allowed for it. These things happened very quickly, and from the events that happen on this day, from then on, Joseph's life is never the same. But now that we're looking at verse 16 and Joseph's actual words, I want to consider these other two headings for today: Joseph's conviction and Joseph's witness, or his testimony. So his conviction. First of all, we see that Joseph was convicted and convinced that God is the giver of this ability and even of every right interpretation. He says, "It is not I." I mean, how easy he could have said, "Yep, you heard right. I can do it. Keep me out of the pit. Even if I mess up this time, I've done it in the past. There's an off chance I could do it again. I am free. I love this robe. I don't want to go back to anything else," right? I can do it. Don't forget, it's your buddy Joseph, your new best friend, Joseph, right? And he just says, "No, it's not me. It's not me." What a thing. He's convinced God is the giver of this ability and of every right interpretation, and he's careful to give God the credit and the glory for it. Even when he could probably press this to get some advantage. Second thing that he's convinced about, that he has as a matter of conviction, that God is sovereign and is the only real God in Egypt. The word he uses here for God is not Yahweh, which is the name of God, right? The personal name of God. And that would be one thing, to come in and just say, well, my God from back home he's given me the ability to do this, and so, he'll do it. But he uses the word for God, Elohim, the supreme one, the superior one, the one who is above everything, the superior being, the supreme being. He's the one who will give you an answer, which may not mean a lot to us. We just see, it says God does it. But picture yourself as Pharaoh. You yourself are worshipped as a god. And your job is kind of like the chief priest of the nation. You are a god. Or put it this way, it's so important for the Egyptians to be in tune with what the gods are doing and what the gods want and all the different things that are happening in the realm of the gods, that no mere man can properly interpret these things and put into practice the order for the world that the gods want. The only one who could do this would be one who was sort of a god himself. And under his direction, he will not only receive these words and these messages from these gods and know their mind and put it into practice, but he will also, under his direction and his tutelage, train up and order a group of other priests who will also help him and assist him in the work, according to his wise decrees. That's who Pharaoh is. And Pharaoh has a message from some God, he thinks, that he can't understand, he can't interpret, and none of his people can. But this Hebrew slave comes in and he's got a message. He understands it and he says, look, it's not any of these gods. It's the God who's above all of that. He will give you a word and it will be for your good. It was receiving these words for the good of Egypt that was Pharaoh's job. And Joseph just says, well, God only does those things. I'm really not important. I'm not like the Pharaoh substitute who can get the message and understand and then help you. I'm not working for Pharaoh. I'm not a little better version of these other people you have. I can't do anything. It's just God and what he decides to do that will make any difference for Pharaoh and for Egypt. So he's totally convinced that God is absolutely sovereign and the only real God that exists in Egypt. Everything in the situation flies in the face of the Egyptian view of things. They're totally helpless in this. I mean, the idea that Pharaoh would have a dream that could be interpreted for the good of Egypt is right up their alley. That's how they work. That's their whole system of religion. Pharaoh's got a message from the gods, and we've all the priests have kind of figured all this out, and now we're going to put it into practice, and we're going to continue to be mighty in the earth and wonderfully successful. But they're stuck because nobody has an interpretation. except this guy, the only guy in Genesis almost, who from beginning to end has been faithful to God. It's incredible. It just so happens to be Joseph. What a thing. The third thing that Joseph is convinced of is that God intends to bless the Egyptians through him. Though he doesn't know exactly how that will work out in the long run, he's convinced that God means to bless these people through him. I mean, isn't it amazing that he says, and God will give you a favorable answer? I know this dream is foreboding and it's scary, but God has a message in it for you that is for your good. It actually is going to be a benefit to you to hear this. I'm sure Pharaoh wasn't thinking that. He wanted to know what was going to happen so they could prepare or whatever, which they do, but the message, the total message from God was one that was a benefit to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians. So Joseph is convinced that God is not finished with him, but that God will still yet make good on his word of promise to Joseph. He simply tells Pharaoh that God will in fact give Pharaoh an interpretation of the dream, and the dream will be for his good if he heeds the message. But Joseph doesn't yet know what the dream is. And that's the other thing. He's telling Pharaoh this, and he hasn't heard the dream yet. That's shocking. I mean, one thing if, well, tell me the dream, and you tell it to me, and I say, okay. All right, God does in fact have an interpretation of that dream. He's told me what I'm supposed to tell you, and it's good. But he hasn't heard any of that. He just says, God will give you a good interpretation of this dream. Tell me. It's amazing. He says it beforehand. He's so confident that God will bless Pharaoh and the Egyptians through him. He's convinced that it's as if God himself is caring for Egypt at this time, meaning to bring blessing to the people through Joseph. It would seem that Joseph has seen a pattern develop in his life. As he has continued and just remained faithful to God and not forsaken God, God has what? God has patiently moved in his life in such a way as to bring prosperity to those that he serves. Why should Pharaoh be any different? Just as with Joseph's father, who prospered under when Joseph was working for him. So also with Potiphar it was the same way. The jailer was the same way. The cupbearer was the same way, though not the baker. That's a noted exception. Why should Pharaoh be any different? So now with Pharaoh and all of Egypt, God's going to bring blessing. Surely in his mind, partly is the conviction that God means to bless the world through his family. He knows that to be true. Through you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Whatever my dealings are with people in Egypt, it's going to be for their good. I know that. I have an important point of application on this that I just want to tell you I have that, and we will look at that here at the end of the message on this point about his faithfulness to God and God then blessing people through him. The fourth thing he's convinced about is that his own dreams will surely come to pass. And this is amazing. We'll have to get into this a little bit later, but for now, I'll just say this. There's some strong evidence for that, but for now, I'll just say this. Just the fact that he has confidence, once again, that he is correctly interpreting these messages and that they are, in fact, from God is evidence enough to tell us that he's confident about those dreams he had back in Canaan about his family bowing down before him. I mean, it would be one thing if he said, well, I've said there are sometimes, look, I've had dreams in the past. Sometimes I thought they were from God. Sometimes I heard about dreams other people had. And when it were my own dreams, I thought I knew what they meant, but none of that's ever happened. And these other guys, I heard what they said, and I thought this was the message, and it did happen, but I don't know. Maybe I can help you, maybe I can't. Instead, he's convinced God has a word for you. The reason you've had these dreams, and the reason no one can interpret them, is because God Himself wants to make sure that you know it's from God that He's giving you this message, and it's going to be for your good. I know it will be. Tells us that He's convinced that these other dreams that He's had and that other people have had, that they also have had an interpretation, and that all of that has been from God. So that tells me that He's still convinced, He still believes in the dreams that He had back in Canaan, that these things will happen. Those are His convictions. Now let's consider His witness. We've kind of delved into this a little bit already, but the witness here is offered to the Egyptian people, I think, in a way that cannot be ignored or explained away. Moreover, this witness to the Egyptian people, in this whole story and what happens throughout the whole chapter, is established at the very beginning of Joseph's interaction with Pharaoh by his words at the end of verse 16. It is not in me, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. God will give it. He didn't wait until the year of famine began to start talking to people about God. The very outset. I mean, the very first thing Joseph says to Pharaoh, no, not me, God. That's incredible. You've heard wrong. You've understood wrongly. It's not me. It's God. And God only. But He's for you in this, Pharaoh. What a thing. This witness begins right here. It is God. The dreams themselves, we're talking about this, the witness, Joseph's witness that this whole situation allows him to have and what God testifies to in Egypt. The dreams take all the initiative and control away from Pharaoh. He loses all power to manipulate and control anything. He's completely at the mercy of God. No one has an understanding about what this dream means. Now this Pharaoh submitted to this. He heard, he got a message from God, and he says, man, okay, we didn't have an answer to this. That's exactly right. That makes sense. That feels right, like this is what this is supposed to mean. This was the foreboding sense that I had, that something bad was happening, and you've given me a way to prepare for it and to sustain our people. Everything that we need, this is good. I submit to this. It's not me, it's God. It's your God. That He's the one. You're right. I mean, doesn't He in fact say that? He says, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God, he says later? This God He's talking about, his wisdom, His knowledge, His revelation is all in this man, Joseph. Put him in charge. Why would I put anyone else in charge? This is the guy. This is God's man. So he completely acknowledges that. Take that Hebrew, this foreigner, and put him in charge of everything. Only in regards to the throne will I be any higher than you. He took this dream so seriously, he upended the whole hierarchy of his entire country and put it in charge of a foreigner. That's how much he believed him. This Pharaoh submitted to this, but a later Pharaoh in Exodus will not. And he's challenged again and again in terms of his authority and his position. And all their false gods are challenged over and over again in Exodus. And finally he has to relent and let the people go. You may remember it says about that man that a Pharaoh rose up who didn't know Joseph. Now it was 400-something years later. It's a long time. Joseph and the blessing that he and his God were to the people of Egypt provided a lasting testimony to them. Not only about Joseph, but about Joseph's God. And things continued well for the people of Israel until a Pharaoh arose that forgot about all that. Didn't care. And that's when fortunes changed for the people of Israel. It's remarkable. That's when they began to be treated so poorly. But so long as the Pharaohs remembered the tremendous blessing that Joseph and his God had been to them, then the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, were allowed to prosper. Now, one commentator said it this way in terms of this witness. He says, if the ruler of Egypt had the dreams and obtained their interpretation only through God's servant, then he would know for sure that God was sovereignly controlling his land and that Joseph was God's spokesman. Right? So we see that. Then Pharaoh acknowledges God's Spirit at work in Joseph. Right? God used an Israelite slave to deliver the nation of Egypt. Once all their own priestcraft and wisdom was brought to nothing, that's when God delivered through this slave. No matter how powerful these nations were, they were still absolutely subject to God's control. That's a powerful testimony. And I just say like that, if you read the rest of this chapter, there's no way the people of Egypt don't understand this. I mean, Pharaoh's upended everything they've done. They've never been putting grain away like this. They've never had a 20% tax on their grain to go to Pharaoh to prepare for. We're just storing it up for what? It's almost like Noah building the ark. Like, what do you... Only if you've heard from God does any of this make sense. Pharaoh was convinced this was, in fact, from God. This never would have happened if the dream... Imagine if the dream had been given to Joseph. That wasn't going to work. Or the cupbearer. That wasn't going to work. He had to give it to Pharaoh. Pharaoh had to be the one. And imagine if these other guys had interpretations. Well, then God wouldn't get the glory. It had to be Joseph. What a thing. So there's this witness. So his deliverance, we see how his deliverance came about. We see his convictions. And we see his witness. Those things are all begun in this portion. In terms of application, the one thing I wanted to bring up, which I haven't talked about much, is I mentioned that Joseph had been faithful to God, he'd been obedient to God, and now God is, he's exalted now, and he is going to be used as a real source of blessing for others. There's an element of that I want to apply to us, and there's an element of that I want to be cautious and warn you not to apply to yourself. On the one hand, it is absolutely true as believers, just as it could be said to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, that through you and your offspring after you, right? Then we're going to bring this blessed. The nations of the earth, the whole earth will be blessed through you and your offspring after you. That's the reality. It's also a reality for us as Christians. We know this. I mean, Jesus tells us this. The disciples tell us this. The New Testament tells us this. That we are meant to be a blessing to the world around us. In the things that we do, in the lives that we live, in our interactions with people. We're meant to bring God's blessing to them. In that sense, the Christians that are faithful and obedient in their lives do in fact bring blessing to people. That's just the reality. Let that be, apply that to yourself. Say, look, I mean, we all know this to be true. If I'm at work and I'm not living like a Christian, they're not getting blessings from Christ through me. They might get them, but it's not through me. Right? So that's plain and obvious to us. Okay. We also know from the New Testament that even, let's say you've got a family, a husband and wife and children, and the woman is a Christian and no one else in the family is. Paul tells us there's a benefit that comes to that family because of God's care for that woman. Right? Does that make sense? God has such care for her that even though in some ways certain things could happen to these other people and it wouldn't bother God, but because He has such care for this one, they get benefits. And they get benefits because God's at work in this person's life and she's different than she was. And so they get the benefits of a godly mother instead of an ungodly mother, and a godly wife instead of an ungodly wife. They get so much benefit from that by simply her being faithful and obedient. So this is a reality. But the other part of things that usually gets said about Joseph and that we see a little bit here is that, people will say, well, Joseph was, God had him in the pit and he was faithful to God and then God exalted him. And so the idea is Joseph's story is usually told kind of in this way. Like, God's going to have you go through a lot of hard things for a while, but as long as you stay true to God and keep believing Him, He's going to spring you out of that pit, and you'll get put on the throne in no time. Look at Joseph. That's a pattern for your life. And I want to pump the brakes on that and say, wait a minute. I mean, I know that Joseph, among his brothers, certainly stands out as the faithful one. But we just read in chapter 38 about Judah and this remarkable repentance that he begins at the end of that chapter, where he realizes his wrong and how unrighteous he'd been. And he comes back, and we find later that he actually came back and lived with his father again, totally repented of all that, and has come back to God. Wonderful. Well, if he's faithful and obedient, how come he's not king? Why isn't he in charge? Why doesn't he get down there and say, actually I'm older than you, and, according to our family, I should be in charge? It doesn't work that way, because God had a specific plan for Joseph. Obedience and faithfulness in your life doesn't mean you're going to get put on this pedestal or whatever, or things are just going to work out for you in a wonderful way that you'd like. That's not how it works. You will be exalted in due time, we're told. Right? Through many trials in this age, we must enter that later kingdom. There's a spot for you there. But it's in another area, it's another time. That's where your crown lies, not here. But usually the Joseph story is told as, and surely you're very aware of this, it's told as though you just kind of hunker down now and be faithful and resist temptation and do all you can to live for God, and then things are going to just work out for you in the end. And that is not what I want. That is not the message at all. That is not why Joseph was sent there, so that we could learn that if things are hard for a while, they'll get better later. That is not the message. God is using Joseph. He brought Joseph down here, Joseph says later, to save many people alive. He was going to, John Piper, I remember him famously saying, there are better ways to save people's lives. Don't call for a famine. That'd be a way. How about that, God? It says he summoned a famine, and he sent Joseph on ahead of them to save them all, to preserve their lives. Well, just don't send a famine. That'd be easy. Well, there's all kinds of other things he's wanting to do. He's wanting to provide this testimony and witness to the people of Egypt. He's wanting to send his people down to Egypt and get them out of the promised land while he's going to do some things there that need to be done. Send them down to Egypt, and at least for a good period of time to insulate them from persecution. And one of the ways he does that is by using Joseph, remarkably, to deliver the people and gain so much good favor in the hearts of the Egyptians that it's hundreds of years later before anybody thinks about taking advantage of these foreign people living in their land and treating them as slaves. That's amazing. And God provides for all of that in this. And what a testimony. Imagine being a later Pharaoh and going through the royal archives and reading about this and thinking, what were we thinking? Not letting them go serve this God. We went to war with this God. Why? Their first national encounter with the God of Israel was an experience of unmixed blessing. He came and preserved them from these years of famine with enough time to get ready, and gave them a man who was capable and wise and faithful enough and diligent enough to see it through. What a huge blessing. That had nothing to do with just the fact that, Joseph was a good, Israelite boy. That's not what we're talking about. God had all kinds of other things he was doing. That's why Joseph was there and exalted the way he was. Thousands of faithful Christians can tell you that faithfulness to God does not mean an easy life or a pleasant life or a better tomorrow. It does mean a crown in eternity, which is far better. But I guess I'm saying let's not have this mechanical view of what my obedience means, my exaltation tomorrow, or in this thing that I'm worried about. It's going to work out good because I'm obeying God really good over here. Let's just get rid of that. But then also, let's not take our eyes off of the great thing that's going to come to us by gazing at setting our goals and our hopes on lesser prizes. Well, again, I'll just say God gave Pharaoh these dreams so that he might give a witness to Egypt about who he was, and also a testimony to his people Israel about how he would move through their history to provide for them, to preserve them, to bless the world through them. Well, that's what I have then for these first 16 verses. Admittedly, I've dipped into things that come later just to explain some things, but next time I speak, we will, I believe, we'll be through the rest of the chapter. At least, well, most all the chapter. I think we'll have a little bit we don't cover. Are there any questions or comments on